Saturday, April 18, 1942. A little afternoon in central Tokyo. The morning air raid drill had ended an hour earlier, a routine one, so routine that no sirens had sounded to begin it and none had sounded to end it. Fire wardens were rolling their hoses back onto the carts. The barrage balloons over the waterfront, raised for the drill, were still up. Mothers were walking home from the shrines. There were baseball games in the parks. The sky over the imperial capital was a flat, hazy spring blue, the kind Tokyoites had come to associate with peacetime. And then an aircraft came in from the east at roof level, green, twin-engined, so low that the people looking up could see the heads of the men in the cockpit. The star on the fuselage was not a red circle. It was a white star on a blue field. Behind that first bomber came another and another. Over the next half hour, 16 American aircraft would strike 6 Japanese cities, 10 over Tokyo, 2 over Yokohama, 1 each over Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. Every plane carried 4 500-pound bombs. None was supposed to be able to reach this place. Inside the headquarters of the Imperial Japanese Navy, staff officers sitting down to lunch heard the first explosions and assumed they were practice charges left over from the drill. A telephone call from an air defense liaison officer and the arrival of a wounded civilian at a nearby police station set them straight. By then it was over. The planes were already streaking west at wave-top altitude toward the China coast. 87 Japanese would be dead by the end of the day, and 151 seriously injured. A steel mill was hit, a shipyard was hit, warehouses burned, an oil tank burned. In the scale of what would come later in that war, it was nothing. The Japanese economy would stitch the damage closed inside a month. And yet, in the 7 weeks that followed that single afternoon, the leadership of the Japanese Empire would throw away the Pacific War plan it had written in December, rush into a hasty new one, and lose 4 of its finest aircraft carriers in the space of a single morning at a place called Midway. The men who made those decisions, when they were interrogated after the surrender, all pointed back to the same moment. Not the bombs that fell, the fact that bombs fell at all. This is the story of how 16 American medium bombers, launched from the deck of an aircraft carrier 800 miles out in the Pacific, flown by crews with no fighter escort and no way back, commanded by a 45-year-old aeronautical engineer who expected to be court-martialed, changed the course of the Second World War in the Pacific. The damage they did was trivial. What they broke was something else. You have to go back to a room in the White House on the evening of December 21, 1941. 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, the battleships of the Pacific Fleet were still smoldering in the harbor at Oahu. The Bataan Peninsula was in retreat. Wake Island had fallen. Hong Kong had fallen. Singapore was days away from falling. And the United States of America, by every measure its own War Department could construct on a map, had no capability whatever to strike the Japanese home islands. Tokyo was more than 3,000 miles from the closest American air base. The longest-range American bomber of 1941, the B-17 Flying Fortress, could not make that trip and back. No carrier aircraft in the American fleet could reach Tokyo and return. No Chinese airfield near enough to matter was still in friendly hands. President Franklin Roosevelt listened to all of that and did not accept it. He called the Joint Chiefs of Staff to the White House that evening and told them, in substance, that Japan was going to be bombed as soon as possible. He did not tell them how. He did not tell them with what. He told them that the country had absorbed the worst military blow in its history and that the war could not be won if the country could not see the war being fought. He wanted bombs on Tokyo. The men in that room left with a task none of them knew how to carry out. The answer came, when it came, from one man, not from the Army Air Forces, not from the Planning Division, not from a committee, from a submariner named Francis Lowe, who held the modest title of Assistant Chief of Staff for Anti-Submarine Warfare under Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations. Lowe was no aviator. He had never flown a bomber in his life. But the men who worked with him agreed on one thing, which was that he noticed what other people walked past. On January 10, 1942, Lowe flew down to the Naval Air Station at Norfolk, Virginia, to look over a brand new aircraft carrier that had just completed sea trials. Her name was the USS Hornet. While Lowe was there, he looked down at the runway and saw something odd. The Navy had painted an outline of a carrier deck onto the concrete so naval aviators could practice their short landings, and at the same moment, a flight of Army twin-engined medium bombers, B-25 Mitchells, came over the field low and slow, practicing simulated attack runs. Lowe put the two sights together in his head. He flew back to Washington, walked into King's office, and asked a question that had no business being asked. Could twin-engined Army bombers be launched from an aircraft carrier? It had always been a ridiculous question. The B-25 had a wingspan of more than 67 feet. Carriers were built for fighters and dive bombers with wingspans of less than 40. No Navy anywhere had ever flown a bomber that size off a ship in combat, because no one had ever tried. King did not dismiss Lowe. Something about the question held him. He passed the problem to his air operations officer, Captain Donald Duncan, and told him to work it quietly. Duncan put in 5 days on it and came back with a planning memorandum roughly 30 pages long, in pencil, covering every variable from fuel to deck length to wing clearance. His answer was that yes, it could be done. A stripped-down B-25, loaded heavy with fuel, with a pilot willing to ride the stall on takeoff, could make it off a fleet carrier deck. It could not land back on. That was still impossible. But it could be launched, and if a friendly coast lay beyond the target, it could keep going until it found a field. When Admiral King read Duncan's memorandum, he passed it to General Henry Arnold, the commander of the Army Air Forces. Arnold read it in an afternoon, reached for the telephone, and called the man he had already decided should run the operation. That man was James Harold Doolittle, Lieutenant Colonel, 45 years old. In civilian life before the war, one of the most famous pilots in America. He had won the Schneider Trophy in 1925, flying a Curtiss racer. He had been, on a September afternoon in 1929 at Mitchell Field on Long Island, the first pilot ever to take off, fly, and land an aircraft on instruments alone, with a hood over his cockpit, so that he could see nothing outside the dials. He held a doctorate in aeronautical sciences from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, earned in 1925, one of the first ever awarded in that field in the United States. He had resigned from the Army Air Corps in 1930 to run aviation fuel research for the Shell Oil Company, where he had pushed the country toward the 100-octane gasoline that would later power every American combat aircraft in the war. He had been recalled to active duty in July of 1940, a year and a half before Pearl Harbor, and promoted to lieutenant colonel at the start of 1942. He was not a combat pilot in the ordinary sense. He was an engineer with a cockpit. And for a mission that existed only on paper, Arnold could not have picked a better man. Doolittle accepted in early February and began building his crews out of the 17th Bombardment Group, which had just relocated to Columbia Army Air Base in South Carolina. He did not tell the men what the mission was. He told them it would be extremely hazardous. He told them any man could pull his name back with no mark against his record. He told them those who stayed would be asked to take off from a runway shorter than any a B-25 had ever rolled down. Every man he asked said yes. While the crews trained in Florida, another problem was being solved at the diplomatic level, thousands of miles away. The B-25s had nowhere to land after the raid. Doolittle's first proposal had been to fly on to the Soviet port of Vladivostok, hand the bombers over to the Soviets under Lend-Lease, and bring the crews home by a longer route. The Soviets refused. They had a non-aggression pact with Japan and did not want to provoke a second front, so the planners looked south to unoccupied China. General George Marshall opened negotiations with Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader, for the use of coastal airfields in Zhejiang province. Chiang was reluctant. He understood that if American bombers flew from Chinese soil, the Japanese army would retaliate against the civilians living near those fields. His concern, as events would prove, was exact. 5 refueling airfields were to be prepared along the coast, with a final destination at the wartime capital Chungking in the interior. The training moved to Eglin Field in the Florida Panhandle at the start of March. For 3 weeks, the crews did nothing but practice short field takeoffs, heaving fully loaded bombers into the air in less than 500 feet of painted concrete. The Navy sent down a flight instructor from the Naval Air Station at Pensacola to teach the Army pilots how a naval aviator did it. His name was Lieutenant Henry Miller. He was a Navy pilot, carrier qualified, and by the end of 3 weeks the raiders thought of him as one of their own. After the war, they named him an honorary raider. He was not the only one to carry that title in the years that followed, but he was the first. The bombers themselves were stripped of everything Doolittle could strip. The ventral turrets came out, replaced by an extra fuel tank. 2 broomsticks were mounted in the tail cone and painted flat black, pointed aft like machine guns, on the theory that an incoming Japanese fighter pilot from half a mile out would see what looked like tail gunners and hesitate. Defensive armament was down to a minimum. Weight was everything. On April 1, 1942, 16 modified B-25s were hoisted onto the flight deck of the Hornet at the Naval Air Station at Alameda, just across the bay from San Francisco. The Hornet sailed beneath the Golden Gate Bridge the next morning. A young Army gunner on board, Sergeant George Larkin, wrote in his diary as the red towers slid by overhead that the men on deck wondered if they would ever see them again. On the second day at sea, Captain Mark Mitcher, the Hornet's commanding officer, climbed onto a makeshift platform on the flight deck and told his crew where they were going. Tokyo. The cheer that went up from the men was, by several accounts, audible down on the hangar deck. A little later, on the same voyage, Japanese decorations, actual medals that had been awarded to American officers before the war for humanitarian work, were brought up and wired directly onto the nose fuses of several of the 500-pound bombs. One of those medals had belonged to the Hornet's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Stephen Jurika, who had served in the American embassy in Tokyo in the late 30s, and who knew the city's industrial districts the way another man would know his own hometown. The men understood what the wired medals were meant to say. What was coming was not just an attack, it was a reply. What happened next, on the cold, rough dawn of April 18 in a sea 800 miles east of Japan, belongs in any honest account of American military improvisation. The plan had been for the Hornet to steam to a point about 400 miles from the Japanese coast, launch the bombers toward dusk, let them cross the coast and hit their targets after dark, and recover the crews at friendly Chinese airfields by morning. None of that survived contact with the enemy. Shortly after 3 in the morning, long before first light, radar aboard the USS Enterprise, steaming alongside the Hornet in a joint task force under Vice Admiral William Halsey, picked up a surface contact in the darkness. Halsey altered course and evaded it. Dawn came. The weather was bad. The sea was running heavy with swells breaking over the bow of the carrier, and a little after 7 in the morning, a Japanese picket boat, the Nito Maru, came over the horizon in plain sight. Halsey had been spotted. A radio transmission had already gone out. The cruiser USS Nashville opened up on the Nito Maru with her 6-inch guns and began the miserable work of sinking a small wooden fishing boat in a rough sea. It took hundreds of shells. By the time Nito Maru went under, the American task force was still more than 650 miles from Tokyo, nearly 200 miles farther out than the planners had wanted. The bombers were heavier with fuel than they should have been. The weather was worse than anyone had forecast. And Halsey had a choice to make. He could turn and run. He could press on at flank speed and hope the warning had not been believed. Or he could launch now, from where he was, and trust that his crews could stretch their tanks to the coast of China. Around 8 in the morning, the signal went up the mast of the Enterprise and was read off on the bridge of the Hornet. It read, in the exact words preserved in the Navy's records, "Launch planes, to Colonel Doolittle and gallant command, good luck and God bless you." Doolittle's bomber rolled down the flight deck first. The Hornet was pitching in heavy seas. Lieutenant Edgar Osborne, the flight deck officer, stood at the forward end of the deck holding a checkered flag, watching the rise and fall of the bow. He timed the drop of the flag to the bottom of a pitch, so that the bomber would lift as the bow came up. Doolittle had 467 feet of deck ahead of him. He made it. The bomber sagged once toward the Whitecaps and climbed. Behind him, over the next hour, 15 more B-25s rolled down the same deck and the same flag dropped at the same moment in the swell, and every one of them got off. Not a single aircraft was lost on takeoff. It was the first and last time in the war that a fully loaded American medium bomber took off from a carrier in combat. They flew west at wave-top altitude, just above the swells, to stay beneath Japanese radar. They came in over the Japanese coast a little after noon local time. 10 of them hit Tokyo. 2 bombed targets at Yokohama. 1 struck the naval base at Yokosuka. 1 hit Nagoya. 1 hit Kobe. 1 hit Osaka. They came in low, dropped their 4 500-pound bombs from around 1,500 feet, and turned west for China. Doolittle himself, flying the lead aircraft, pulled up over northern Tokyo, climbed to roughly 1,200 feet to give his bombardier Staff Sergeant Fred Bramer a clean run, released his 4 incendiary clusters on the factory-dense industrial district below, then dove back to rooftop level and pointed his nose at the sea. His aircraft flew within sight of the Imperial Palace and did not strike it. He had ordered before the mission that the palace was not to be attacked under any circumstances, partly for strategic reasons, and partly because he understood what a bombed palace would mean to a Japanese people who regarded their emperor as divine. Some of what the other crews did that afternoon did not fully emerge for years. Lieutenant Travis Hoover, flying the 2nd bomber off the Hornet, came in so low over the northern edge of the city that the debris from his own bomb impacts, by Doolittle's later report, was thrown to a height greater than his aircraft. Lieutenant Robert Gray in the 3rd bomber, after dropping his ordnance on his primary target, strafed a military barracks on his way out. Lieutenant Edgar McElroy in the 13th bomber hit something unusual at Yokosuka. Lying in her fitting-out dock, nearly ready for launch, was the former submarine tender Taigei, which the Japanese Navy had been converting into a light aircraft carrier and renaming Ryuho. One of McElroy's bombs opened a hole in her port side more than 20 feet across and killed 7 men on board. The damage pushed Ryuho's commissioning back roughly 4 months. Civilians watching from the streets below, in those first confused minutes, often waved at the passing American aircraft because they had never seen a B-25 before and assumed the planes were part of a friendly exercise. 80 American volunteers, 16 bombers, half an hour of flying time over the target. A raid that had taken 3 months to plan was over before most of Tokyo understood it had begun. If the names of those men mean anything to you, a tap on the like button helps their story keep finding the viewers who still care about the record. What happened next, inside the Japanese High Command, was not reported to the Japanese people for a long time, and in some cases was never reported at all. The propaganda apparatus in Tokyo moved quickly to soften the blow in public. Japanese newspapers ran editorials describing the raid as a cruel attack on schools and hospitals, which it was not, and accused the American airmen of strafing civilians indiscriminately, which some had done and some had not. The official communiques played on the English word Doolittle, rendering it as the Do-Nothing Raid and the Do-Little Raid, trying to fold the whole event into a kind of bitter joke at American expense. The public, by most accounts, was not fooled for long. Word of broken windows and burning warehouses and dead neighbors traveled through Tokyo in the usual way. It travels through any city, person to person, and the reassurances from the government had to work against what people had seen with their own eyes. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, and the most respected naval officer in the empire, was aboard his flagship, the battleship Yamato, anchored in the Hashirajima anchorage in the inland sea, when the first reports came through. According to his principal biographer Hiroyuki Ogawa, working later from the accounts of Yamamoto's staff, the admiral took the news badly. Ogawa describes a man in something close to physical collapse, retreating to his cabin and leaving the initial Japanese response to his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki. Yamamoto's own war diary does not confirm the detail. What Yamamoto did say, and what he wrote in a private letter a few days later, was that it was a disgrace for the skies over the imperial capital to have been defiled without a single enemy aircraft shot down. That last phrase is the one that matters. The damage had been almost nothing. It was the reaching that had wounded him. Ugaki, as chief of staff, scrambled the pursuit. 3 aircraft carriers of the Kido Butai, the same First Air Fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor, were ordered to give chase. They found nothing. The Hornet and the Enterprise were already hundreds of miles east at flank speed, and the Japanese carriers returned to the inland sea 4 days later, empty-handed. The home islands had been reached, and the men whose duty it was to prevent that from ever happening had failed. For Yamamoto, the raid was not just a tactical embarrassment, it was personal. He had told the Emperor, in essence, that the fleet would keep the home islands safe, and the fleet had not. His private letters from the week after the raid, quoted in Ogawa and in the work of other Japanese biographers, describe a man in something like despair. He told his staff that another raid like this one, or worse, could not be permitted. He told them that until the American aircraft carriers, which had obviously launched the attack, were hunted down and sunk, the home islands could never be considered safe. And here is where a personal wound started to move a war. For months before the Doolittle Raid, Yamamoto had been pushing a plan that most of the rest of the Japanese high command did not want. The plan was to attack an obscure pair of American sand islands in the Central Pacific called Midway. Yamamoto's argument was that seizing the atoll would force the surviving American carriers to come out and fight on Japanese terms. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo thought the plan too ambitious. The Imperial Army considered it a waste of shipping at a moment when operations were already underway in the Southwest Pacific. Through late March and early April, Yamamoto had forced the Naval General Staff to grant a grudging compromise only by threatening to resign as Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet. The resistance had bent but not broken. Then came April 18. Before going into the rooms where the final decisions were made, it is worth pausing on the shape of what the raid had set in motion. The Doolittle Raid did not change Japan's war plan once. It changed it several times, in several different directions, each change pulling another change with it, until the defensive map that Japan had drawn in December of 1941 no longer existed. The first change was the recall of fighter units. Japanese Army Air Force fighter groups that had been slated for operations in the South Pacific and Burma were held back in the home islands instead, for domestic air defense. Britannica, summarizing the post-war reckoning, puts the figure at 4 fighter groups retained in Japan through 1942 and 1943, at the precise moment when those squadrons were desperately needed over the Solomons, where the fighting for Guadalcanal would consume Japanese naval air power for the rest of the year. The second change was a massive retaliatory campaign inside occupied China. Japanese intelligence, unable to believe that a medium bomber the size of a B-25 could have taken off from a ship, concluded that the raiders must have come from airfields along the Chinese coast. It was wrong, but the Imperial Army acted on the belief. Beginning in May, roughly 180,000 Japanese troops were committed to an offensive through Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, aimed at seizing and destroying the airfields from which the Japanese army believed the raid had flown, and at punishing any Chinese civilian suspected of sheltering an American flyer. The campaign laid waste to an area of some 20,000 square miles. The death toll among Chinese civilians has been estimated by American historians, including James Scott in his book Target Tokyo and Rana Mitter in Forgotten Ally, at as high as 250,000, counting both the direct killing and the deaths from disease in the wake of a parallel biological warfare campaign. Other scholars put the number somewhat lower. No American account of the Doolittle Raid can be honest that does not record that the Chinese paid in a currency the Americans never had to spend. The third change was the one that broke Japan. On May 5, 1942, Imperial General Headquarters formally issued Navy Order No. 18, authorizing the operation against Midway. Yamamoto had what he wanted. What he did not yet see was the price. The plan was now going forward under enormous time pressure, with a shortened planning window, with a simultaneous diversionary operation in the Aleutian Islands that would pull 2 Japanese carriers, the Ryujo and Junyo, away from the main effort and out to the fog belt of the North Pacific, and with a general atmosphere of urgency that left the combined fleet staff no time for the careful wargaming the operation deserved. The Aleutian diversion was supposed to confuse the Americans into splitting their own fleet northward, away from Midway. In practice, because American cryptanalysts had already broken the Japanese naval code, it simply handed 2 more carrier decks to the secondary theater, where they would not be able to reach the main battle in time. In the first week of May, the combined fleet ran a series of war games aboard the battleship Yamato at the Hashirajima anchorage. According to the post-war account of Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the first wave of Japanese aircraft over Pearl Harbor and who co-authored a book about Midway after the war. There came a moment in those games when an umpire ruled that two of the attacking Japanese carriers had been sunk by American land-based bombers. A senior officer overruled the ruling, declared the carriers refloated, and the exercise continued. Modern historians, including Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully in their revisionist account Shattered Sword, have treated Fuchida's version of the story with caution. Whatever exactly happened in that room, the mood at the top was clear enough. No more bad news about carriers was welcome. What made the Japanese reaction so self-destructive was that the intelligence picture never resolved. The Imperial Army continued through May to believe the raid had come from China, and acted accordingly. The Imperial Navy, correctly this time, concluded it had come from a carrier and planned Midway on that basis. The Empire was, in effect, defending against two simultaneous and contradictory threats. Every direction on the strategic map was now a possible line of attack. The defensive perimeter Tokyo had drawn in December 1941, running from the Kuriles down through the Marshalls to the East Indies, was suddenly judged insufficient. It had to be pushed outward, in every direction at once, at a cost in ships and aircraft and men the Empire could not sustain. When American reporters in Washington later pressed President Roosevelt on where the Doolittle Raid had come from, he answered with a deliberate bit of misdirection, borrowed from the James Hilton novel Lost Horizon. He said it had flown from Shangri-La, a fictional city somewhere in the Himalayas. The Japanese High Command, not knowing whether the answer was a joke or a code, began preparing to defend against attacks from directions that existed only in a novel. This is the central irony of the Doolittle Raid. It did not force Japan to retreat. It forced Japan to spread out, and the spreading broke the army and the navy that tried to do it. On the morning of June 4, 1942, 6 weeks after the raid, American dive bombers from the carriers USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown came down on the 4 Japanese fleet carriers of the Kido Butai as they steamed toward Midway Atoll. The dive bombers pushed over at around 20,000 feet. In the space of about 5 minutes, between roughly 10:20 and 10:25 in the morning, 3 of those carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were set ablaze by direct hits. The 4th, Hiryu, was destroyed the same afternoon. The 1st Air Fleet, the formation that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, had ceased to exist as a fighting organization. The trained naval aviators lost with those ships were harder to replace than the ships, because Japan had never built the training pipeline a long war would demand. In a single morning, the Empire lost its offensive striking power in the Pacific, and it would not get it back. The war was 6 months old, and the chain of decisions that had broken the Japanese Navy had begun on an April afternoon when 16 American bombers appeared at rooftop height over a city that had never, in all its history, been flown over by an enemy. If your father or grandfather served in the Pacific, in any branch, on any ship, at any rank, I would be honored to read about him in the comments. What carrier, what squadron, what island, what year. Names and specifics are what keep the record alive. Official archives only hold so much. The rest sits with the families who carry it, and it deserves to be preserved by them. Historians have argued for decades about how large a role the Doolittle Raid actually played in Yamamoto's Midway decision. Some scholars note that Yamamoto had been pushing for Midway since early February 1942, weeks before the raid, and that the attack was really the event that broke an internal political logjam already tilting his way. Others argue that without the shock of April 18, the Naval General Staff would have kept blocking the plan, and the Battle of Midway, as history remembers, it would never have been fought at all. For most of the 20th century, the question had to be answered by reading between the lines of post-war Japanese memoirs, which were written by men with every reason to shape the record to suit their own reputations. Then, in the months after Japan's surrender in August 1945, a group of American analysts landed in Tokyo to do something no army had ever done in quite that way before. They were going to interview the losing side while the memories were still fresh. The organization was called the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. Its Pacific branch was staffed with economists, engineers, naval intelligence officers, and a large number of Japanese-American linguists fluent in the language and in the military culture they had come to investigate. Between September and December of 1945, the survey conducted hundreds of formal interrogations of senior Japanese officers, cabinet officials, industrialists, and planners. The transcripts, now held in the United States National Archives, run to thousands of pages. They are one of the most extraordinary primary sources on what Japanese leaders actually thought, in private, as opposed to what they would later write for public consumption. What the survey found about the Doolittle Raid was not what its American analysts had expected. They had expected that senior Japanese officers, looking back on a lost war, would downplay a raid that had caused so little physical damage. What they got instead was the opposite. Captain Yasumi Toyama of the Imperial Japanese Navy, who had served as Chief of Staff of the 2nd Destroyer Squadron during the Midway operation, was interrogated on October 1, 1945. He told the survey that the raid had crystallized what had previously been an unspoken feeling across the senior staff. The feeling was that this war was not going to be the short, contained campaign they had been promised. It was going to be a long war against an enemy who would find a way to strike the home islands whenever he could, and who had already managed it inside 4 months of Pearl Harbor. The survey's published summary report, drawing on interrogations like this one, concluded that the Doolittle Raid had been one of the decisive early events of the Pacific War, not for the damage it caused, but for the way it supported a growing conviction that the Japanese defensive perimeter had to be pushed outward. That conviction, the survey found, led directly to the operations at Midway and in the Aleutians, and indirectly to the vast commitment of Japanese naval air power in the Solomons that would bleed the empire dry through the rest of the year. The most revealing of the USSBS transcripts came from Mitsuo Fuchida himself, the same officer who had led the first wave over Pearl Harbor. Asked about the Doolittle Raid, Fuchida did something his interrogators did not expect. He praised the operation. He called the one-way attack from a carrier excellent strategy. He noted that the American bombers had slipped under the Japanese fighter defenses by flying much lower than the defenders had anticipated. And he said something bitter, too, to any American reading the transcripts in '46. He criticized the Japanese Army Air Force for claiming after the raid to have shot down 9 of the American aircraft, when in fact it had shot down none. Those false claims, Fuchida told the interrogators, contributed to an atmosphere inside the Japanese military in which the true scope of what the raid meant was not honestly faced until it was far too late. Another senior officer interviewed by the survey, Captain Kameto Kuroshima of the Combined Fleet Staff, the man who had drafted much of Yamamoto's planning and whom his colleagues called the God of Operations, used a phrase that has stayed in the record since. He said the raid passed like a shiver over Japan. It was not a military phrase, it was a human one. What had shaken the country, in Kuroshima's words and in the testimony of others, was not the bombs. It was the sudden collapse of a promise. The promise that the Army and the Navy had made to their own people at the outset of the war, that the sacred soil of the home islands could not be touched by any enemy. Once that promise was broken, nothing could put it back together. The decisions that followed, the rushed planning for Midway, the Aleutian diversion, the reprisals in China, the recall of fighter squadrons from the south, were all attempts to rebuild a sense of security that could no longer be rebuilt. They were the actions of a military that had lost something it could not admit it had lost. The verdict on the Doolittle Raid, in the end, is not the verdict that was printed in American newspapers on April 19, 1942. Those newspapers celebrated a triumph and printed headlines about bombers over Tokyo. They were not wrong, but they did not quite see what they were looking at. The raid was not primarily a military operation. Its bombs did almost no physical damage. Its targets were largely repaired inside weeks. The cost to the raiders themselves was high. Of the 80 men who flew, 15 crews reached the Chinese coast, though every one of their aircraft was lost, either crashed or abandoned by parachute when the fuel ran out. One crew, led by Captain Edwin York, diverted north after his engines began running too rich to reach China on his remaining fuel. York set his bomber down at a Soviet airfield north of Vladivostok. The Soviets, technically neutral in the Pacific War, interned him and his crew for 13 months before letting them make their way out through Iran. What York and his crew did not know at the time, and what was not declassified for decades, was that their escape had been engineered by the Soviet Internal Security Service to give Moscow plausible deniability with Tokyo. 8 of the 80 were captured by Japanese forces in occupied China. 2 more, Sergeant William Dieter and Corporal Donald Fitzmaurice, drowned when their aircraft ditched in the surf off the Chinese coast. The captured 8 were held for months, interrogated under torture, and put on a mock trial that by most accounts lasted less than half an hour. 3 of them, Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, and Sergeant Harold Spatz, were shot by firing squad at a cemetery outside Shanghai on October 15, 1942. A 4th, Lieutenant Robert Meader, died in a Japanese prison camp on December 1, 1943, of beriberi and dysentery. The remaining 4, Lieutenant Chase Nielsen, Lieutenant Robert Height, Lieutenant George Barr, and Corporal Jacob de Shazer, survived roughly 40 months of imprisonment, most of it in solitary confinement, and were freed in August of 1945, most of them weighing less than 100 pounds when American paratroopers got them out. Doolittle himself, who had bailed out over a paddy field in Zhejiang and was convinced he would face a court-martial for the loss of all 16 of his aircraft, was instead awarded the Medal of Honor by President Roosevelt, promoted 2 grades directly to Brigadier General, and sent on to command the 12th, 15th and 8th Air Forces in the European theatre, where he would lead the final strategic bombing campaign against Germany. The reprisals inside China remain the darkest chapter of the story, and the most often forgotten. So what then was the raid? It was an attack on an idea. The idea was that the Japanese home islands were untouchable, that the emperor's people, in the cities and the factories and the schoolrooms, did not have to fear what had come to every other country Japan had fought, in Korea and China and the Philippines and Singapore. The raid broke that idea on a single afternoon, and once it was broken, the men running the Japanese war effort could not plan their war the same way again. They had to pull fighter groups back from the Solomons to defend Tokyo. They had to launch a punitive campaign inside China against a raid that had not actually come from China. They had to accelerate the Midway operation into ground they had not prepared. They made bad decisions fast, and the bad decisions built on each other. 7 weeks after Doolittle's bombers cleared the Japanese coast, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were burning in the Central Pacific, and the war Japan had started in December was a war it could no longer realistically win. 16 aircraft, 80 men, almost no physical damage. One of the most consequential military operations of the 20th century. None of the men who walked out to those B-25s on the morning of April 18 knew any of this would follow. They did not fly to start the Battle of Midway. They did not fly to break the Japanese Navy. They flew because a president had demanded an answer, because a naval captain had noticed an outline painted on a runway, because a test pilot had said yes, and because 80 volunteers had said yes after him, most of them expected to die. Many of them did not live to see what they had set in motion. Master Sergeant Paul Leonard, who had been Doolittle's own engineer-gunner over Tokyo, was killed in North Africa on January 5, 1943, when a German aircraft attacked his airfield at Aix-les-Bains. He was still carrying on, in another theatre, a war that the raid he had helped fly had made possible to win. Corporal Leland Factor, a 20-year-old farm boy from Plymouth, Iowa, who had flown as engineer-gunner on the 3rd B-25 off the Hornet, died that same April night on a mountainside in Zhejiang province during his bailout. He was the first raider killed. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, whose aircraft hit the surf just short of the Chinese coast, lost a leg in a field hospital run by Chinese villagers and American missionaries, and spent the rest of the war recovering. He later wrote a memoir called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, which became, for an entire American generation, the book that was the raid. Every one of the 80 had been an ordinary man before he volunteered. Bank clerks, farm kids, mechanics, a handful of career pilots. Most of those who came home went back to small towns and quiet jobs and did not talk about any of it unless someone asked the right way and waited for the answer. They did a thing that needed doing, and the doing of it, far more than they ever understood at the time, bent the shape of the largest war in human history. Back at home in April of 1942, Americans got the news of the raid the way they got most news in those years, over the radio in the kitchen, out of the newspaper at the breakfast table. The headlines did not bury it. A Los Angeles paper ran the line, "Doolittle do audit." Congressmen in Washington told reporters that at last the offensive had begun. Families who had not had good news out of the Pacific in 5 months, since the burning hulls at Pearl Harbor, had one. It would be years before the public understood that the raid had also set in motion the events that led to Midway, and that Midway had turned the whole war. What the country knew in April was simpler than that. It knew that American bombers had reached Tokyo, and that was enough. If this account gave you something you did not already know, the like button helps it reach other people who care about the record being got right. Not flattered, not scorned, just got right. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. There are many of these stories. Most of them are about ordinary men who did ordinary work in a moment when ordinary work turned out to be the hinge the whole war swung on. They earned the remembering. And the least we owe them now is to remember them with the details intact, with the cost counted honestly, and with the weight of what they did held in our hands the way they held it in theirs.